In the summer of 1834, in the rolling hills of Virginia, a slaveholder sat down to dinner. His silver fork gleamed. His wine-glass caught the light. But when he lifted the lid from his plate, it wasn't roasted meat he found waiting. It was his own severed tongue. And standing in the doorway was Clarissa, the enslaved woman who had served him, and silenced him forever. Virginia, 1834. The tobacco fields swelled under the heat, and plantations stretched across the land like kingdoms. Here, the system of slavery was not just an institution. It was the air itself, woven into every breath, every law, every stone in the foundation of the big houses. At the center of this story was Clarissa, an enslaved woman in her 20s. She had been born into bondage, raised on the plantation she now served. Her days were consumed not in the fields but in the master's house, cooking, cleaning, serving meals, tending to the whims of her owner, Edward Graves. Graves was a man of wealth and cruelty, a figure both polished and feared. To outsiders he was refined, educated, charming, a landowner who dressed in tailored suits and quoted scripture. But to those under his rule, he was a tyrant. Behind the closed doors of his mansion, his word was law, and punishment was swift. Clarissa knew his cruelty intimately. For her, the lash was not the worst torment. It was the humiliation, the way Graves spoke to her as though she were less than human, the way he forced her to serve guests who laughed and toasted their fortunes while her people withered in chains. There were darker cruelties, too, unspoken but known. The nights when women were summoned to his chamber, their silence bought by fear. Clarissa endured. She bowed her head, answered softly, carried trays heavy with food, but inside her something sharpened. Each insult was a cut, each night of service a spark, and in the dark she began to imagine a reckoning. Daily life in the house was a theater of subjugation. Clarissa rose before dawn, preparing breakfast for Graves and his household. She polished silver until her fingers cracked, scrubbed floors until her knees burned. When Graves hosted dinners, it was Clarissa who laid the table with precision, who stood silently by as men discussed crops, politics, and profits wrung from enslaved bodies. The food was rich: roasts, stews, wines imported from Europe. Clarissa prepared every dish but was allowed only scraps. The contrast was unbearable. She starved while the master grew fat on her labor. The cruelty spread beyond the table. Clarissa watched Graves sell families apart on the auction block, laughing at their tears. She saw children whipped for moving too slowly, and she herself felt his hand more than once when he was drunk. His threats hissed into her ear. It was after one of those nights that something inside her hardened into stone. She no longer dreamed only of escape. She dreamed of justice, of silencing the voice that had tormented so many. Whispers of rebellion drifted through the quarters. Stories of Haiti's Revolution, of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia just 3 years earlier. Clarissa had listened. She knew the risks. For every slave who rose, 10 more were hanged in retaliation. Yet she could not silence the thought. What if one act could send a message? What if his voice, the source of so much cruelty, could be taken away? And so she began to plan. She watched his habits. She knew when Graves drank too much, when he fell asleep in his chair by the fire, his mouth slack, his head lolling. She knew the sharp knives in the kitchen better than anyone. She knew which servants could be trusted to look away, and which might betray her. Every day she rehearsed in her mind the strike, the silence, the placing of the tongue on the plate, a symbol, a warning, a truth too terrible to ignore. The night came in late summer. The air was thick, heavy with cicadas. Graves had been drinking more than usual, celebrating a successful sale of crops. He retired to his study, then to his chair, a glass of wine still half full beside him. Clarissa waited until the house fell quiet. Then she moved. The kitchen knife gleamed in her hand as she stepped into the study. Graves stirred but did not wake fully. His eyes fluttered open in confusion as she leaned over him. Before he could cry out, she acted. The blade flashed. His scream was short, muffled, cut off as she pressed a hand to his throat. When it was done, she held in her hand the very instrument of his cruelty, his tongue, the source of every insult, every order, every violation. She carried it to the dining room. The table was still set from the evening's meal, silver polished, glasses half drained. Clarissa placed the tongue neatly on a silver plate, setting it as though it were a delicacy for the master who had demanded everything of her. Then she stood back and waited. The first to find it was another servant who gasped and fled. Then came the mistress of the house, whose scream shook the walls. Soon the overseers stormed in, finding Graves bleeding, half-conscious, his mouth ruined, unable to speak. Their master's voice had been silenced forever. Chaos followed. Clarissa did not run. She stood in the dining room, her face calm, her hands still stained red. When they seized her, she did not beg. She had already spoken in the only way that mattered. The aftermath was brutal. Graves survived, but without his tongue, his words became slurred grunts. His power diminished. He could no longer command with his voice, no longer humiliate with cutting insults. He lived the rest of his days in a kind of living silence. Clarissa's fate was sealed quickly. She was tried not in a courtroom, but in the court of the master's rage. Some accounts say she was whipped until her back was torn open, then hanged as an example. Others whisper she was burned, her body destroyed so no trace remained. Still, others insist she escaped in the chaos, vanishing into the woods, her story carried only in rumor. What is certain is that her act left a scar on the plantation. The white families whispered about it in horror. The enslaved whispered about it in awe. The woman who had cut out her master's tongue became a legend. Historians rarely recorded her name. In official ledgers, she was a criminal, a savage, a cautionary tale. But in the oral histories passed down through generations, she became something else, a symbol of resistance, of a voice stolen finding a way to speak through action. Even now, fragments of her story linger. The plantation itself is gone, its house rotted into ruin, its fields reclaimed by forest. But among descendants, the tale of Clarissa survives. A woman who dared not only to rise against her master but to strike him at the very root of his power, his voice. It forces us to ask, how many other stories like hers were buried? How many women resisted in silence, their courage erased from history books but remembered in whispers? This was Clarissa's story, one of suffering, defiance, and a revenge as symbolic as it was terrifying. But her story is only one among thousands, most of which remain untold, hidden in the shadows of America's past. If you want to uncover more hidden stories of slavery and resistance, watch this playlist here. And if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe so history's silent stories can finally speak again.